On September 15th, 2017, at 7:55 in the morning Pacific time, Mission Control at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory received the final signal ever sent by the Cassini spacecraft. By the time that signal arrived, Cassini had already been gone for 83 minutes, vaporized in Saturn's atmosphere nearly 900 million miles away. Because that's how long it takes light and radio waves to cross that distance. For 83 minutes, a machine that no longer existed was still talking to Earth. 2 days earlier, on September 13th, Cassini had aimed its cameras one final time at the rings of Saturn, at the icy moon Enceladus, at the orange haze of Titan, and captured its last photographs before mission engineers steered it into a deliberate death dive, a controlled destruction designed to keep it from ever accidentally contaminating one of Saturn's potentially habitable moons. The world watched. Scientists at JPL cried on camera. Headlines called it the end of an era, and then largely, the public moved on. But the data didn't stop speaking, not even close. Because right now, in 2025 and 2026, researchers combing back through Cassini's archived transmissions are publishing findings in journals like Nature Astronomy and the Planetary Science Journal. Findings that are quietly rewriting what we thought we understood about our own solar system, including findings that speak directly to one of the oldest questions humans have ever asked. This is the story of what a dead spacecraft is still teaching us, 8 years after it burned alive in a planet's atmosphere. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what Cassini actually was. Not just a spacecraft, the most ambitious planetary explorer ever built by human hands up to that point. Launched in October of 1997 with the European Huygens probe attached to its side, it spent nearly 7 years crossing the solar system before arriving at Saturn in 2004. What followed was 13 years of continuous discovery around a planet our telescopes could never see clearly enough to understand. Over the life of the mission, Cassini captured more than 450,000 images, completed nearly 300 orbits of Saturn, and traveled almost 5 billion miles. It found liquid methane seas on Titan. It discovered water ice geysers erupting from the south pole of a small moon called Enceladus. It mapped Saturn's magnetic field in detail no instrument ever had before. It flew directly through the ring system. Scientists always knew Cassini's data was so dense, so layered, that it would take decades to fully process. What they didn't fully appreciate, it turns out, was exactly how right they were. The mission's very first major triumph came just months after arrival, and it's worth remembering because it set the tone for everything that followed. In January of 2005, the Huygens probe separated from Cassini and descended through Titan's thick, hazy atmosphere on a parachute, eventually touching down on solid ground, the first and still only landing ever achieved on a moon in the outer solar system. Huygens survived the impact and kept transmitting for over an hour from the surface, sending back images of a landscape carved by liquid, dry riverbeds, rounded stones that looked eerily like they'd been shaped by flowing water. Except on Titan, at nearly minus 290 degrees Fahrenheit, the liquid in question wasn't water at all. It was methane and ethane, cycling through evaporation and rainfall in a strange, cold mirror of Earth's own water cycle. That single landing told scientists Titan wasn't just an interesting moon. It was an entire alien world with weather, geology, and seasons of its own. And it primed the mission team to expect the unexpected from everything Cassini would find afterward. The most daring part of the entire mission happened at the very end. By early 2017, Cassini was almost out of fuel, and NASA engineers faced a choice. Let the spacecraft drift uncontrolled, risking an eventual crash into Enceladus or Titan that could contaminate a potentially life-bearing moon with Earth microbes, or take a calculated risk and fly it somewhere no spacecraft had ever gone. They chose the second option. Over 22 orbits between April and September of 2017, mission controllers threaded Cassini through the roughly 200-mile gap between the top of Saturn's atmosphere and the innermost edge of its rings, a region nobody had ever entered, nobody could be certain was even survivable. Engineers genuinely worried the spacecraft might collide with an unseen ring particle at tens of thousands of miles per hour and be destroyed on the very first pass. As a precaution, they oriented Cassini's large dish antenna forward, like a shield, during the riskiest sections of each orbit, sacrificing communication with Earth for a few tense minutes at a time in exchange for a slightly better chance of survival. It was survivable, 22 times with every instrument running at full capacity the entire way through. Then, on September 13th, 2 days before the final plunge, the cameras fired one last time, capturing Enceladus, Titan, the rings, and Saturn's northern hemisphere, before Cassini's own trajectory carried it into the atmosphere and it broke apart. The images from those final days looked complete when they arrived. Beautiful, even. But the instruments doing the real scientific work during those 22 dives weren't the cameras. They were the mass spectrometers and dust analyzers quietly sniffing and tasting the environment in that never-before-explored gap. And what they measured was so unusual that some scientists initially suspected their own instruments had malfunctioned. It took teams of researchers months of careful cross-checking, comparing instrument readings against each other, ruling out contamination and calibration drift, before anyone felt confident enough to say publicly that what they were seeing was real. Here's what those final orbits actually found. Cassini's ion and neutral mass spectrometer, essentially a device that identifies chemicals by their molecular signature, detected complex organic compounds raining down out of Saturn's rings directly into the planet's upper atmosphere at a rate exceeding 20,000 pounds, roughly 10 tons, of material falling every single second. Scientists had known for years about a general phenomenon called ring rain, water trickling slowly down from the rings toward the planet. But the scale and chemical complexity Cassini measured during its final dives, methane, propane, butane, and other carbon-based compounds mixed in with the water ice, was far beyond anything earlier estimates had suggested. Researchers even proposed an explanation for why so much organic material and so relatively little pure water ice showed up in the readings. A previously undetected belt of energetic radiation nestled inside the rings themselves, capable of stripping water molecules apart and leaving behind the heavier, more radiation-resistant organic and silicate material to fall toward the planet instead. At that rate of loss, researchers calculated the rings, at least in their current form, could be gone entirely within a time frame as short as 100 million years, practically an eye blink in planetary terms. Saturn's rings, one of the most iconic and seemingly permanent features in the entire solar system, may actually be a temporary structure, a relatively brief chapter in a much longer ringless story. Cassini's death dive gave scientists the first real numbers to understand just how temporary, and it forced a broader rethink of where the rings even came from in the first place, with some researchers now favoring the idea that they formed relatively recently, perhaps only a few 100 million years ago, rather than existing since the birth of the solar system. The same final orbits handed physicists a separate mystery that remains genuinely unresolved. Every other planet in the solar system with a magnetic field has one that's noticeably tilted relative to its rotation axis. Earth's magnetic north sits measurably apart from geographic north. Jupiter's field is tilted. Uranus and Neptune are tilted dramatically, almost sideways in Neptune's case. Saturn's magnetic field, by contrast, is aligned with its rotation axis to within a fraction of a degree. A precision so extreme, it creates a genuine theoretical problem, because standard dynamo theory, the physics explaining how planets generate magnetic fields in the first place, says a field that perfectly aligned should not be able to sustain itself. It should decay and collapse. Cassini's final close passes measured that alignment with more precision than ever before, and confirmed the anomaly is real, not an instrument artifact. Scientists still don't agree on why. Some propose a hidden internal layer, a kind of stable shell deep inside the planet that's somehow canceling out the tilt. Perhaps a region where helium rain, droplets of helium condensing out of Saturn's hydrogen-rich interior, sets up an electrically conductive layer that masks the true tilt from outside observers. Others think the standard model of how planetary magnetic fields form may simply be incomplete. Either way, Cassini didn't resolve the mystery. It sharpened it and handed the physics community a puzzle that's still being worked on today, one of the few basic, unresolved questions left over from an otherwise triumphant mission. There's a third finding buried in that same grand finale data that took years longer to fully surface. In a paper published in the Planetary Science Journal, researchers revealed that Saturn's rings, which appear in every photograph as a flat, razor-thin disk, are actually surrounded by a vast, invisible halo of fine dust particles extending out to roughly 3 times Saturn's own radius above and below the ring plane. This halo was completely undetectable from any telescope, on Earth or in orbit. It could only be found by a spacecraft physically flying through the outer edges of it, which is exactly what Cassini did during its final approach, without anyone realizing at the time what the readings meant. The rings of Saturn, already the most visually dramatic structure anywhere in the solar system, turned out to be larger and structurally stranger than any image had ever shown, extending into a region of space that photographs simply cannot capture, because there's nothing there for light to reflect brightly enough to see from a distance. But nothing in Cassini's archive compares to what came out of a fresh reanalysis of the Enceladus data, published across a series of papers in late 2025. This is the discovery that changed the conversation. Enceladus is tiny, small enough to fit inside the continental United States, wrapped in bright ice, and it orbits Saturn in less than 33 hours. When Cassini first arrived at Saturn in 2004, Enceladus wasn't considered particularly interesting. That changed within a year when Cassini discovered enormous geysers, jets of water vapor and ice erupting from cracks near the moon's south pole and shooting material thousands of kilometers into space, feeding Saturn's faint outer E-ring. Those plumes told scientists something remarkable. Beneath that frozen shell, Enceladus hides a global, salty liquid ocean, kept from freezing solid by the tidal flexing Saturn's gravity exerts on the small moon's interior. Over the following years, Cassini flew directly through those plumes repeatedly, sampling their chemistry. It found salts at concentrations comparable to Earth's oceans, evidence the water was in direct, ongoing contact with a rocky seafloor rather than sitting isolated inside an ice shell. It found silica grains, a mineral signature that only forms when water at very high temperatures, somewhere around 200 degrees Fahrenheit or more, interacts directly with rock before rapidly cooling. Strong evidence for active hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, the same kind of environment many scientists believe helped give rise to the earliest life on Earth. It found simple organic molecules, including some nitrogen-bearing compounds that hinted at more complex chemistry happening somewhere out of view. Each discovery was remarkable on its own, and together they turned Enceladus, within the space of about a decade, from an overlooked ice ball into arguably the single most promising place in the entire solar system to search for life beyond our own planet. Then, in October and November of 2025, two research teams went back into Cassini's archive with better instrumentation matching techniques than existed when the spacecraft was still flying, and what they found went further than anything previously confirmed. A team led by researcher Nozer Khawaja, working with Cassini's cosmic dust analyzer data from a high-speed 2008 flyby, published a paper in Nature Astronomy identifying organic compounds that had never been detected before in Enceladus material: aliphatic and cyclic esters and alkenes, ethers, and tentative signs of nitrogen and oxygen-bearing compounds. These aren't exotic, meaningless space chemicals. Esters and ethers are structural components of lipids, the molecules that build every cell membrane in every living thing on Earth. Their presence doesn't prove life exists inside Enceladus. It proves something almost as significant, that the chemistry happening inside that hidden ocean isn't simple or static. It's active, complex, and producing the same categories of molecules that, on our planet, sit upstream of biology's most basic building blocks. Because these particular grains were collected during one of Cassini's fastest, closest flybys, just minutes after being ejected from the moon's cracks, researchers could be confident the molecules hadn't been altered by years of radiation exposure in space. This was fresh ocean chemistry, caught almost in the act. Frank Postberg, one of the study's co-authors, put it plainly. These molecules prove the complex organics Cassini had previously found in Saturn's E-ring aren't simply the product of long-term radiation exposure. They're readily available inside Enceladus's ocean right now, meaning whatever is producing them is an ongoing process, not an ancient one. A companion analysis published by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in November of that same year echoed the finding, describing a diversity of organic chemistry in fresh plume particles that scientists had never observed together in one sample before. And researchers involved in the work were careful to note there is still far more unexplored data sitting in the archive from that same flyby alone, with follow-up papers already in progress. It's worth pausing here to be precise about what all of this does and doesn't mean, because it would be easy to overstate it. Finding esters and ethers is not the same as finding amino acids, and it's certainly not the same as finding life itself, or even direct proof of the more complex biological molecules like DNA or proteins. What these compounds represent is closer to raw ingredients and half-finished intermediate steps, chemical waypoints on pathways that, on Earth, sometimes lead toward biology and sometimes simply don't. Scientists studying Enceladus are careful, publicly and repeatedly, to describe the moon as potentially habitable, meaning it appears to have the ingredients and energy sources life as we understand it would need, rather than confirmed to be inhabited, which is a far stronger and currently unsupported claim. That distinction matters enormously, and reputable researchers in this field insist on it every time they're asked, because the gap between habitable and inhabited is one of the largest open questions in all of science, and closing it will likely require a dedicated future mission, rather than any amount of additional reanalysis of 40-year-old data. A parallel piece of Cassini's legacy delivered the opposite kind of surprise, a correction rather than a confirmation. For years, scientists largely assumed Titan, Saturn's largest moon, a body bigger than the planet Mercury, wrapped in a thick nitrogen atmosphere and covered in lakes of liquid methane, almost certainly hid a deep, extensive subsurface ocean of liquid water beneath its icy crust, similar in spirit to Enceladus. Titan's internal heat and tidal activity seemed to make that a near certainty. But a 2025 reanalysis of gravity and tidal data collected by Cassini more than a decade earlier pushed back against that assumption, suggesting Titan likely does not host the kind of large, deep water ocean previously theorized, and that its interior behaves differently than models had predicted, perhaps involving a colder, more sluggish ice shell than scientists had assumed, one that doesn't flex and respond to Saturn's tides in quite the way a genuine liquid ocean underneath would require. It's a useful reminder that Cassini's legacy isn't only about confirming hopeful predictions. Sometimes the same archive that hands scientists a startling confirmation on one moon delivers a humbling correction on another, and both outcomes matter equally to actually understanding these worlds rather than just hoping for the most exciting possible answer. Then there's Mimas, one of Saturn's smaller moons, best known for a single giant crater that makes it look unmistakably like a certain fictional space station. For years, Mimas was considered about as geologically dead as a solar system object gets. No geysers, no detectable internal heat, nothing but ancient cratered ice. In early 2024, researchers analyzing subtle wobbles in Cassini's tracking of Mimas' orbital motion announced something that upended that picture entirely. Mimas, it turns out, has its own liquid water ocean hidden beneath its surface, and a surprisingly young one, likely having formed sometime within the past 5 to 15 million years, essentially newborn in geological terms. Nothing about the moon's ancient, battered exterior gave any external hint of what was happening underneath. Only the precise pattern of its orbital wobble, recorded by Cassini years before anyone knew to look for it, revealed that a substantial body of liquid water was sloshing around inside a moon everyone had written off as dead rock. What makes Mimas especially striking to planetary scientists is that its ocean is thought to sit unusually deep beneath a thick, undisturbed ice shell, which may explain why it produces no visible surface cracks or venting plumes the way Enceladus does. It's an ocean hiding in plain sight, discovered not by anything the moon showed on its surface, but purely by the mathematics of how it moves. Step back and look at the full picture Cassini's archive has assembled, piece by piece, discovery by discovery, sometimes years apart. A system where multiple moons appear to hide liquid water oceans beneath their surfaces, including at least one that gave no external clue it was there at all. A ring system actively raining tons of complex organic material into its parent planet's atmosphere every second, on a timeline that could see those rings gone within 100 million years. A magnetic field so precisely aligned with the planet's rotation that it defies the standard physics of how such fields are supposed to survive. A vast, previously invisible halo of dust surrounding those rings, extending far beyond anything any telescope had ever detected. And rising from the south pole of a small, unassuming moon, jets of water vapor carrying esters, ethers, and nitrogen-bearing compounds, the same broad categories of molecules that, on Earth, sit at the foundation of cellular life. All of it came from one spacecraft, across 13 years of active exploration, and one final, deliberately fatal plunge. All of it is still being decoded, nearly a decade after the mission technically ended. The European Space Agency has already identified Enceladus as one of its highest priority targets for a future mission, with plans under study for a spacecraft that would fly through, or potentially land near, the moon's plume-venting south pole to sample that material directly, rather than relying on decades-old flyby data. Such a mission, if approved and funded on a realistic timeline, likely wouldn't launch until sometime in the 2030s, and wouldn't reach Saturn for years after that, a reminder of just how enormous the gap in time can be between identifying a compelling target and actually being able to study it up close again. NASA's Europa Clipper, currently en route to Jupiter's ice-covered moon Europa, is applying many of the same ocean world investigation principles Cassini helped pioneer at Saturn, and its arrival in the early 2030s should offer the first real point of comparison between two very different ocean worlds studied with modern instrumentation. The entire field of astrobiology now organizes serious scientific attention around a category of worlds that barely existed as a concept before Cassini flew. Ocean worlds, moons hiding liquid water beneath frozen shells, treated as genuine high-priority targets in the search for life beyond Earth. Enceladus, Europa, Ganymede, Titan, and now Mimas, 5 worlds in the outer solar system where liquid water may currently exist. Before Cassini, that list was mostly speculation. After Cassini, each entry rests on direct measurement. What makes all of this genuinely remarkable is that Cassini wasn't built to look for life. It wasn't a life detection mission. Its instruments were designed to measure magnetic fields, chemical compositions, ring structures, atmospheric dynamics, general planetary science for a system nobody had studied up close before. And yet, sitting inside its final transmissions, in the 22 orbits through a gap no spacecraft had ever entered, in dust grains collected during a high-speed flyby back in 2008, and not fully understood until 2025, it recorded exactly the kinds of molecules that build cell membranes on Earth. It found hidden oceans inside moons that showed no outward sign of harboring one. It found rings apparently evaporating into their planet on a geological blink of an eye. It found a magnetic field behaving in a way current models say it shouldn't be able to. None of these were things Cassini was specifically sent to find. They were sitting in the data the entire time, waiting for scientists to develop the tools and the understanding needed to recognize what they were actually looking at. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of planetary exploration. Instruments built to answer one set of questions, ending up answering an entirely different, and sometimes far more profound, set of questions instead, simply because they happened to be pointed in the right direction at the right moment. That archive still isn't finished giving up what it holds, Researchers studying Cassini's full dataset estimate the mission's complete scientific yield will take another decade or more to fully extract, and new papers continue to arrive nearly every year, each one occasionally reshaping something scientists thought they already understood. Some of that ongoing work involves entirely new statistical and machine learning techniques being applied to decades-old raw instrument readings, methods that simply didn't exist when Cassini was still transmitting, capable of pulling faint signals out of noise that earlier analysis methods would have missed or dismissed entirely. Every advance in how scientists process and interpret this kind of data effectively hands them a slightly different spacecraft to work with, even though the physical instruments and the raw measurements themselves haven't changed at all. The spacecraft itself has been gone since 2017, torn apart and vaporized in Saturn's upper atmosphere. But in a very real, ongoing sense, it is still working. Still transmitting, just far more slowly now, through the patient, painstaking labor of researchers, running new analyses on old numbers and finding things that were there all along, simply invisible until the right question and the right method came along to reveal them. There's something worth sitting with in the sheer asymmetry of this story. Cassini spent 13 years actively orbiting Saturn, and it has now spent nearly a decade dead, and that second silent period has already produced discoveries arguably as significant as anything the mission announced while it was still alive and flying. The 2024 Mimas ocean announcement came 7 years after the spacecraft burned up. The most detailed Enceladus organic chemistry findings arrived in late 2025, 8 years after. The magnetic field puzzle and the dust halo were pieced together gradually, in stages, across roughly the same span. None of it required a new spacecraft, a new launch, a new decade of travel time across the solar system. It required people, sitting at desks on Earth, returning again and again to information that had already arrived, asking better questions of it than anyone had thought to ask the first time around. In an era when planetary missions cost billions of dollars and take years or decades to plan, launch, and fly, that's a genuinely underappreciated lesson. Sometimes, the most efficient way to make a major discovery in space isn't to build something new. It's to look harder at what you already have. Cassini's Final Images didn't capture the world's attention because of what was visible on the surface, the beauty of Saturn's rings, or the haze over Titan, or the geysers erupting from Enceladus. What makes them matter, years later, is what was hidden inside them, information that needed years of scientific progress before anyone was equipped to properly read it. Not a message written in any code or pattern, but one written in the plain language of chemistry and physics, in organic molecules erupting from a hidden alien ocean, in the subtle wobble of a moon's orbit that nobody thought to examine closely enough, in dust and charged particles tracing invisible lines around a gas giant. Cassini recorded all of it during a mission that ended in fire in September of 2017. And piece by piece, paper by paper, scientists are still working out exactly what it was trying to tell us. A machine built to study a distant planet ended up handing humanity some of the strongest direct evidence we have that we may not be entirely alone in our own solar backyard. Its final photographs didn't close that story, they opened one. And nearly a decade later, we're still only partway through reading the first chapter.